Okay, I have discovered the reverse engineering thing. I haven't fully mapped it out in all of its consequences, but I just wanted to start making this recording as soon as possible because it's finally all coming together and it's all coming back to me. So, um, what I was saying in the last recording, in terms of the clerical work that I needed to do, in terms of how I described that heuristic that was way off, but anyway. So let me just describe what the solution is. So essentially, the thing that makes emotional tones have stable have it has there are two sets of codexes or something like that. There are two rubrics that the emotional tone, the metagram emotional tone circuitry that I derived because I had to see patterns before I even had a model of emotional tones. I discovered circuitry before I discovered the emotional tones. And so, how I mapped out circuitry was I mapped it out in alchemical signatures and in uh, which I knew corresponded to the 12 extraction from the 17 dimensions of psychological reality. And then the final five elements, the five dimensions, essentially, which are most closely associated with the awareness of awareness unit inside of ourselves, the actual seat of consciousness, the actual consciousness provider and grammar foundations. It's the thing that can't be abstracted as the object of consciousness because it is the thing that is generating um, consciousness. So, in some sense, the internal axis of driving conscious grammar, the observer itself, the actual your subjective purview, the five elements of that subjective purview are between themselves, and this is described, I believe, in as the throne of God in Revelation, um, that is surrounded by the four beasts that worship and the 24 elders, the 24 elders being the 24 emotional tones, and the four beasts being being the four field circuits that sort of how those 24 emotional tones are connected with one another within sub fields, as it were, of connectivity, between the 12 cognitive functions that make up the 24 emotional tones, depending on the directionality of connectivity within those little beastly field circuits or whatever. But so they're all described as having six wings and three faces and eyes, or I guess I'm slightly conflating the description of in Revelation with the description in Ezekiel. But anyway, the so essentially it's sort of in statistical terms it would be 5 choose 2, that any emotional tone can be described as being framed between two of the final five. Now, there are also multiple ways, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So, an emotional tone, in terms so basically, I sort of, man, I keep on not forgetting how to pronounce this word, but I circumnavigate, located, what the hell is that word? Circum, I sort of triangulated how to define an emotional tone by saying, okay, well, people are, at least, well, this was the element, this is a kind of, my word, well, this is how I empirically modeled metagram, was that I could say, I could intuitively, essentially, empathize with someone to the extent to which I can say, okay, these are the drivers, these are the internal things that are driving their um, cognitive inflection. So their use of an emotional tone has a certain signature of, let's say, its internal axis of drivation, the thing that is driving it in the conscious, in from the throne, as it were, of their seat of consciousness. So there, two out of the five elements in their seat of consciousness is electing an emotional tone, is playing an emotional tone, is emulating or performing an emotional tone in their conscious grammar. Okay, and that is the color of their teleological edge. That is their purport, or that is the signature of the source of their purport. So I'm trying to read that from people, while at the same time, in some sense, I had to sort of work this out, perhaps only now in the full integration of it, but that the only thing that I could really get a grip on was the alchemical elemental signature, which is very, very ambiguous. But in outlining that these things can be seen as being positioned, as emanating from being framed by these elements of the final five, that then sort of they are in a geographical territory that is being framed by these elements of the final five. And these two of the five elements of the final five are containing, it is sort of, they're creating an arena. Now again, like, you can always describe an arena like this by a different framing. Actually, I don't know if that's entirely true. There is one ambiguous framing, because not all arenas can be ambiguously framed, but some. So according to that one metric of framing things by final five choose two, some if the frame is happening next door to one another, then it can be stably defined by one framing. But there are some anyway. I think that the ambiguously framed ones that might have a kind of, they might have a fundamentally ephemeral quality to them. For example, what is 1/10? 1/10 is, I'm not even saying it correctly, but is confused. So literally confused is one of these ambiguous frames, because confused is dimension 1 negating dimension 10, and dimension 1 and dimension 10 can either be framed between dimension 3 and dimension 7, or it can be defined as falling between dimension 16 and dimension 14 on the obverse, on the long way around. And that's merely because dimension 1 and dimension 10 are in sections falling between the final, because the final five elements are I don't know where to start, if I should start from 16 or 3, but 16, 3, 7, 11, 14, those are the final five. Okay, so which two of the elements of the final five are framing the arena, in some sense, could be regarded as being the minimum and the maximum, perhaps, or I don't know if it's worth it to try and make mathematical analogies, but essentially they contain between them, that they contain the spectrum of the apperception. They are the things that are bounding the or giving rise or to the emulation of the cognitive inflection. So they are essentially the ones um, that are supporting that thought form. They're providing the edification or the edifice that that thought form needs in order to coalesce. So it is the driver, it is the internal driver from the throne that is allowing the emotional tone or the beast to be entertained or to be is instrumentally using the beast. So the beast is fundamentally um, conforms to how the throne is commanding it. Okay. Okay. So essentially, then, when you look at the 16 dragons, which are just alchemical formula, which conflate the 12 extraction into 4 elements, and then there are ambiguously 3 elements that make up each alchemical symbol of the 4 alchemical elements. So you get the 12 dimensions of cognitive reality, and you just kind of ambiguously conflate them into 4 elements. And that's the perspective of the dragons, that essentially and that has to do in some sense with that there is almost analogously in a beastly way that there's an internal conditioning, or there's an internal, let's say, stabilization in terms of how mechanically you pull on one string and the tension can be redistributed along these certain lines of interconnectivity between the field circuits, or at least these certain kinds of. But in some sense, I don't think they don't naturally. The field circuits themselves don't just operate in a dumb way. They have to get their energy is supplied to them by the final 5. That is essentially driving these mechanisms. They only move at the as they are commanded from the throne, as it were, from the final 5. I don't want to speculate too much about how this exactly integrates with scripture, but essentially, I do think that in some way you could probably say that all the corruption that takes place might happen purely within dimension 3 and dimension 7 in the blood, essentially, and that in some that the heavenly elements of the final 5, because I regard dimension 11 to be the Holy Ghost, and dimension 14 to be the Word, and dimension 16 to be the Father, that those things are essentially obscured by the corruption that is held essentially or locked in the blood. And although perhaps you can also say dimension 1, which is the flesh, and because essentially dimension 2 is not properly containing or encapsulating the flesh within its overarching understanding, which should be but anyways, so there is, let's say, an alchemical treasure to be transmuted, and the philosopher's stone or something like or the understanding of the doctrine, or whatever, the foundation of truth, is to be implanted somewhere in the calf, as it were, in the calf field circuit. So the because it's interesting that it's called the one of the heavenly beasts that surround the throne of God has the head of a calf. It's interesting because Ezekiel describes it as, I think, as a bull, but anyway, in Revelation it's described as a calf. I'm not sure what I said, if that's correct about Ezekiel, but yeah, I do think it's perhaps more precise that it's a calf, which is a youngling thing, perhaps. Anyway. And there is something tender about a young animal, which all the other ones are not. The other one has the head of a lion, the other one has the head of an eagle, and the other one has the head of a man. Um, anyway, what's my point? Okay, so anyway, I'm just trying to give an account of the process that I did in order to uncover metagram circuitry. So, using this information, I intuited from alchemical symbols and from empirical sort of trying to observe which elements of the final five are framing cognitive inflections, because I don't know the definitions of emotional tones, and then I drew the field circuits. Deriving them empirically from the baser elements of just reading it as alchemical symbols and reading it as different framings. Because essentially my typology in metagram circuitry was a brute forced empirical data capture, where I was trying to see the full, because I was capturing data that I didn't fully understand, but I was capturing it as a kind of raw data that then I spun into the emotional tones, and then once I derived the emotional tones, that opened up a new vista, and that kind of absorbed me, and it was actually very difficult to capture the data that I captured. I literally had a major manic episode to do that, which is very similar to in Homeland, the TV series. The CIA, it's a bit of an impossibility, because no one who has bipolar type 1 would ever be employed by the CIA. They would be screened out. They would be prevented from being that kind of, I don't know what she was called, an investigator or something like that, or and so she actually cracks the case, because she's been working on this case for years and years and years, and she's been collecting all this data and observation, and then she literally has a major manic episode, in which case your IQ goes off the chart. You kind of, because I don't want to go through the whole description of it, but essentially you unbound all of your, you have a kind of ego death, which I don't necessarily recommend, because it's not the same as the crucifixion. It's an ego death because it's the idea that, okay, there's no resolution to the false ego complex, therefore go back and sort of re-litigate the sacred contract and try to re-emerge a new false ego complex. So it's kind of like just trading a new false ego for trading an old false ego for a new false ego, instead of actually using that as the identity that you use to kind of crack the ultimate integration sequence or something like that. So it's kind of, you run out of moves, and then the only move that you have left is to try to restart the game over. So then all of your subconscious perspectival memory banks or whatever, they become unfixed, and you kind of re-enter an oceanic phase of development. You go almost into a childlike state. And children, very young children, when they are in the oceanic phase, they have incredibly high IQs. They're making connections in a dreamlike state because they have no structure bogging them down, and they are making connections. So it's kind of like going through the oceanic phase of a child, but not being a child. You have the benefit of your experience, but the experience is being unbounded by the filing system that existed in your subconscious. So you have access to an entire array of data, essentially, and so you can make far reaching conclusions. And often these things are you know, and the conclusions that one draws are, you know, can often be psychosis essentially, because they are at the same time seeing patterns and connections between things, but starting from an edifice of nothing, from a perspectival structural bank of nothing. And so, you know, and so you have this richness of experience, but you have a poverty of any structure while you are looking for a new operating anchor to start the subconscious off again. So in some sense, you are re-emerging the seed of your identity, or the common the grounding of your identity, or something like that. So you're trying to start off a new germ, as it were. And so, I mean, you're probably not even relitigating the sacred contract. You're just finding a new manifestation for the sacred contract. So your super ego is pushing the delete button on your subconscious, and it's saying, you've kind of litigated with it via the ego, that the ego will actually won't be complicit with this continuing charade, because the ego essentially sees no resolution. And so the ego actually asks the superego to please delete the subconscious and start again, essentially, or to radically reconvene the subconscious. So it's a kind of reconvention. But at the same time, as you're letting go of all the belief structure in the subconscious, you are unbridling all the experience, essentially. And this is also destructive. I mean, you know, people know this from brain scans, that essentially there's actually physiological harm that's happening in the brain as connections are being ripped apart. Um, because whole subconscious belief structures are being reformatted, essentially. But as they are being reformatted, the loose data is not entirely lost. It's just that it needs to be yoked or roped into a new subconscious convention, or set of conventions. So you are literally reconventionalizing your perspective. So it's a kind of rebirth, but yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's perhaps similar to a kind of I wonder, it might actually be, you know, I wonder if it could be perhaps regarded as a kind of trial by fire. I don't think I would describe it exactly as what I would think as a baptism by fire, because it's not a surgical fire that is actually burning away the chaff. It's just burning away something to be replaced by something. It's anyway. Um, so it's an uncontrolled burn, and what's replacing it, the new thing that grows in its place, is not necessarily better at all. It's just going to be different, or it's just going to be a reincarnation, perhaps, um, of at least a reincarnation of the false ego complex. But it's going to inherit the experience of the prior. And in some sense, I think that the the ego still ends up retaining quite a bit of a fundamental imprint of what was before, and the subconscious can still, everything in the subconscious, because although you've reformatted it to a new conventional perspective, you still have access to that experience that you can still yoke back in. And so, there's going to be a fundamental bias in, so, just because you've ransacked the filing cabinets to and you've thrown all the papers on the floor, and you're looking at them all simultaneously, and you're kind of seeing the patterns between them, doesn't mean that, like, they can't be recaptured or reassimilated. And if they are reassimilated, if you were coherent or cogent the first time, you're going to recreate the same structure to the extent to which that your structures perhaps held good water in the first place, or had, so there's going to be a kind of bias in the data capture that is there in the first place. Anyway, the reason, I knew this kind of going in to developing my false ego complex when I was 5 years old. I knew Paul Kruger, who, sorry, is that, doesn't sound like the proper name. The surname was Kruger. Famous psychology professor at Rhodes University, who is a sort of family affiliation of mine. The grandfather of my half-sister. And he was certainly, he was an academic, and he was a gifted academic at that. And I had long conversations with him about psychology, and he did a lot of very important research for me that helped me craft my project. But essentially, I anticipated this, and in some sense, I designed my life around this, around having a major manic episode in my early 20s, so that I could condense all the data that I would meticulously collect from the age of 7, or specifically, perhaps more so, from the age of 10. So that when I had this major manic episode, I would have access to a data bank that was primed to be meditated on, or in order to precipitate it. When I had my major manic episode, I reconvened my personality around a new quest, or a slightly modified quest, which is that, find the answer now, or synthesize the solution now, or model what's going on inside of people's minds, which was essentially very similar to my initial false ego complex, because I can't exactly remember what the formulation. It all falls under the same umbrella of everyone should care for me, and everyone should care for me version 2.0 was, well, I was it was, I guess, everyone should care for me. First iteration was collect the data, and second iteration is, okay, turn the data into a model. And I had to choose a false ego complex that would be driven by a general operating command that could be pliable enough and paradoxical enough that I could have the latitude of most of my good faculty while emulating a false ego complex myself. Anyway, lots of complexity in my project, but anyway, okay. So so I collected these. I from the age of 5 years old, or 5 or 6 years old, I had the 17 model, and that was basically my, I don't know what to call it, but essentially a model of epistemology, and using that philosophical structure then, and also knowing already then about the 12 extraction, that the 12 emotions were 12 dimensions of psychological reality I had an intuition that there were these emotional tones, something like emotional tones, but the problem was that I needed a skeleton first. So essentially, I needed to. It isn't enough to know mechanically what's going on. The hard part was metatype. That was actually the hard part. Metagram was sort of, I could have. So it's weird that I had to sort of have a version of Metagram that was ambiguous enough that I could use it as a stepping stone to find metatype, and then after perfecting metatype, go back and actually properly understand Metagram, because you can't, you kind of have to solve them both simultaneously, essentially. Anyway, I don't want to technically go into it more than that. You know, because the idea that you could have the one solved without solving the other one is essentially is just not feasible, or it's not, that could never be respectable. I mean, it's just palpably ludicrous to think that you could. You kind of have to do it both simultaneously. So sort of ramping up the one to the maximum, and then going to the other one and doing the maximum possible, and then also having general speculation as to what the future kind of structure of integration might be. So you have it's a juggling balancing act. That's quite gargantuan, and it's anyway. The biggest hurdle in some sense is being able to see the apex of the pinnacle of integration intuitively before all the kind of technical specificity. And so that's why I needed to have a very high IQ that you can kind of only get with a major manic episode. But I mean, and this is well known in the psychological literature. Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein 1 and Wittgenstein 2, people even call him a different iteration after his major breakdown. I mean, this is a common thing, that you get geniuses that break down in their early 20s, and then they reinvent themselves completely. They reconventionalize everything, which doesn't really happen in the modern era anymore because of psychiatric medication. You get Newton, for instance, was found in a pentagram of his own blood, meditating on some alchemical occult thing, in his early 20s. This it happens to geniuses, that they have that their false ego runs out, and then they do this kind of fire. They have such a they were so serious in the compunction of driving their false ego complex, and when they realize that their false ego complex has run out of road, and that they're just sort of what's the word, when you're just in the water, kicking the water just to stay in the just to stay in the just to stay afloat in the same place. They call it, is it treading water? So when they realize that the false ego complex is fundamentally treading water, it does not compute, because they were actually legitimately or authentically or trying to propel this vehicle forward. And when they see that sort of solution is not possible under the ambit of its actual thing, then it realizes, oh, I'm actually a bad robot. And when you realize that you're actually a broken, bad robot, then you have to kind of go back to the junkyard, or go back to the man behind the curtain, to the superego, to ask for redress or remedy. And the only remedy is essentially sort of self-deletion. And so there's a kind of, what you are doing knows that what you're doing is so illegitimate or inauthentic or fundamentally self-inconsistent, and your subconscious is actually would rather have its spirit slayed and reborn than continue on. So it tries to slay itself and look for a new incarnation, as it were, and that which I mean is I mean you could say in some sense, I mean because I mean the real problem with this is that the problem of the superego still persists, and you still need to fix the superego. So when you're trying to get help from the superego, and you actually need to fix the superego, but the false ego complex has to be in a strong enough state so that it can actually perform the crucifixion, so that it can heal the superego. But essentially, if you don't have that kind of doctrinal anchorage, ultimately, I would say, the point of having a false ego complex is just so that you can actually stop it from being false at some point, that you graduate from the falsity. But that's also going to be a particularly bespoke, peculiar process, because I mean, it's difficult. I haven't helped other people go through a baptism by fire exactly. Um, well, I mean, I've tried, but I mean, I could certainly perhaps profit from more insight into the different metatypes, to understand the I mean, if anything, everyone's just going to be fundamentally typecast by their particular dimension of psychological reality that corresponds to the dragon. It's probably going to be the thing that typecasts them, so you, yeah, I mean, yeah, I shouldn't be overly sensitive where I'm trying to give sympathy to people's dragons in some sense. I mean, they all need to be slayed anyway, essentially. Um, or the idea that you have to play with people's dragons so that you can teach them to slay their own beast. I mean, that might be a kind of tactical ploy or something like that. But sadly, I think the more play you give to that, the more you're just going to allow yourself to be railroaded by their sort of fundamental self-deceptive iniquities and such. But well, yeah, I mean, there might be other facets of other metatypes that are particularly worth knowing let's say in a clinical setting, um, which is it's really quite sad that I don't have the status of a clinician, because if I did, I would probably be able to advance my work, at a breakneck kind of speed, because then I would see very quickly and clearly, perhaps the missing link in, or at least either in the theory or in the methodology of how to translate this theory into a, a clinical practice. But I mean, generally speaking, I mean, I did help develop dialectical behavior therapy, and that, and I mean, I've also been able to help modify it purely by just having discussions. Oh my word, it's so embarrassing that I forget people's names. With Helen, I believe it's Helen. Anyway, it's slightly dangerous to speak like this, but anyway, anyway, I should think about this. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is something to be said perhaps about the professionalism of the. I do think that, or anyway, I mean, I shouldn't perhaps talk too prematurely. I should stay more speculatively. But I do think that, the therapeutic alliance, which is essentially, I think, on some level, connotates things like a spiritual master. That kind of relationship might be helpful, but perhaps I shouldn't be too presumptuous. Um, I know Jung suffered tremendously being in the doctor's chair. I mean, he complained about it profusely, because essentially, he would help people with all their neuroses, and then essentially, when it actually came to integration, they were just like, "No, I'm happy that you've cured me of my neurosis. I don't need to do any kind of shadow integration. Thanks, but no thanks." It's sort of, you do all this preparatory work to put the ego in a strong enough position where it would sort of be robust enough to actually do the integration, and then they're not interested. It's just they're just a sort of a happy demigod now, or they can sort of. But yeah, I mean, there also are minor mysteries that I still need to solve, like what some of the how some of the dragon ambiguity, because the actual master alchemical formulas that amount to the 16 dragons, how they present themselves in conjunction with the particular framings of the various particular metagram circuits, because that'll also shed more specific light as to the kinds of clinical presentation or psychological manifestations that will actually happen, um, in terms of the latitude that people have in using different arms of the, or anyway, I do actually have a port of call to research that myself. Um, because each three metatype metagram circuits have, I believe they have all of the complexity, because one has a double circuit. I'll have to find my category diagram that I made, but actually it might not have a single entity circuit, so which is fine by me. Yeah, there. Although it would be nice, I mean, I guess it doesn't have an example of a double-barreled emergent response that is cornered, so I would have to find some other metatype and try work out what having a cornered emergent response, how exactly that manifests. Anyway, sorry, I'm referring to jargon that is well established in other recordings, so I'm not going to describe that here. Anyway, okay, so perhaps I've gotten far too ahead of myself, talking about these things generally. I guess I'm trying to contextualize it also for myself, see the lay of this. So what makes a metatype 13? So I should have double checked this. Is that you have a master alchemical dragon formula, no, you don't have that. You just have the framing. You just have a sequence of framing. And there are 17 sequences of framing. So you take those 17 sequences of framing, and then you interface that with the 16 dragon alchemical master formulas. But some of the dragon alchemical formulas are also ambiguous. Why are they ambiguous? Oh. They're ambiguous because of the different kinds of double-barreled things. Yeah, this actually explains the complexity theoretically, which is better as well than having to look for it empirically, or because then I can also use it as falsification. So so the framings. But why would a sequence of framing is a kind of interpretive thread? So you have a particular metatype where one particular dimension is going to correspond to the dragon and the superego. And then relative to that, it's going to have a fixed sequence of frames in the final five. Why would it do that? Why would it only have one? And then it would test all the master alchemical formulas. Why? To find anything that corresponds with that, because what is it about the master? Because that's the circuits themselves have a kind of intrinsic spider web interconnectivity. So they are like attachment points. So sort of almost seeing the 17 dimensions segregated or contained by, the placement of the final five within the 17 is sort of creating a dream catcher or a kind of like spider web. And you need to have enough sort of objective energy to structure or to stabilize the dragon. So it's the arena that the dragon can then lord over or operate over, or it is the dragon itself. Because the dragon is the manifestation of superego motivation, the child function of the superego. The child function of the superego actually has a positive eye to controlling the world. And so it has to triangulate the world by attaching to a web of a field that it can lord over. And so the elements, it has to have enough broadly, it has to have a sequence, a circuit made up of emotional tones. That is how it attaches itself to 17 model. Okay, well, maybe I should just look at okay, so is wood is, did I not write what excited is? Yes, I did. 412. 412 and 1317. What frames 412 and 1317? But it's predominantly 1317. So 1317 is framed by, oh no, wait, that's also ambiguous. 3 and 14. Is it ambiguous? 3 and 14 and, yeah, it is ambiguous. What did I just say? Was that 1317? 1317 is framed by, what did I say? 3 and 14, or it can be framed by 14 and 16. That's ambiguous on the level of the framing. This 14, 16 comes up a lot. Oh man, I remember this now. Oh my word, I remember these double-barreled signatures in the dragon designation framing and at some point I think I worked out that one of them is extraneous. Anyway, 412, what is it? 12 over 4. What is that? 12 over 4. That's framed by 14 and 3 and 11 11 and 3. Man, that's so familiar writing out things like that. Oh my word. Oh man, I remember this was, I hated this. Word. I need a computer matrix. Oh my word. Okay. What can I do with this? Let me see. How does that compare with? No, my word. Why is it so different? Or maybe it's not. Let me look at the signature. Shoot over is Calm Lonely, which is something that I've done recently. What is Calm Lonely? Is 16 over 7. Oh no, wait. 16 over 7 and yeah, and the other one is also 16 over 7. And what is it? Nine over 4, 8 over 5. What is 9 over 4, 8 over 5? 9 over 4, that's 3, 14. And 8 over 5. It's the same, 3 over 14. It doesn't seem right. How can that? Oh no, no, that does work. Okay, so what's did I just say? Those are both the same, actually. Well, yeah, the emergent response and the primary counteroffer is always the same, because they make up a corner. Do you not get cornered emergent responses within themselves? Yeah, no, you don't. Anyway, what I said earlier doesn't apply. 8558. So what is that? That is, what did I just say? Shy, relaxed, sad, relieved. Shy, relaxed, sad, relieved is all 3 over 14. So that means that it's always going to be only 2 sets of framings. It's going to be the stimulus and then the primary counteroffer, because the primary counteroffer is always cornered with the emergent response, so it's just 2 sets of framings. So that's... Where did I write it? Where did I write it? But if it's 5, choose 4, surely that doesn't give you 17. Perhaps with ambiguities it does. Okay, 3 over 14, framed by 3 and 14 is... What's the other stuff? Oh, yeah, 16 and 7. So the first anxious 2 metatype 13 is framed by 16 and 7 in the stimulus and 3 over 14 in the primary counteroffer and emergent response. I'm a metatype 13 as well, but I'm a first angry 8, and I am framed by some ambiguities, but let's see, is 3 over 14 is one of, or with it, which annoyed is 3 over 14, but it can also be described as 14 and 16. But there's the 3 and 14, so there's the correspondence. And then my stimulus is 5 over 2 and 1 over 10, which is, where did I write it? Yeah, it's also 16 and 7, framed by 16 and 7. So my stimulus is framed the same, and my primary counteroffer is framed the same. Although, if I'm correct about what causes bipolar, because I have a virtual primary counteroffer which is projected from my secondary emergent response, that is creating a virtual new cornering, an ulterior cornering in my primary counteroffer that would break the frame of the metatype 13, and so that is why I don't allow, that's why a metatype 13 in my metagram circuit would not allow the entry into the use of the other emotional tone, because it would break the motivational structure of the so the dragon doesn't act out of character of its particular structure. You can actually, when the bipolar is acting out in the secondary personality, as it were, or sorry, the virtual primary counter offer, what they are in fact doing is they're creating a I don't know if there's an insightful analogy to be made, but they are putting the Scarlet Dragon into disintegrity with itself, into a kind of disunity. They're making the dragon act out of character to its own mysterious majesty or whatever. So they really are sort of looking beyond the gate of the knowledge. They're breaking the knowledge of good and evil. They're somewhat trashing the entire structure of the superego in terms of its the holographic projection which the false ego complex is coming out of it. Yeah, they're actually breaking the dragon, but they're probably not directly breaking the beast, so it's not that helpful. Anyway, perhaps I should just check the third one. The third one is relaxed, sad, shy, relieved. Did I do that? Yeah, I did. That's 314. And then lonely and calm. What is lonely and calm? Why do I have both of those things there? Oh, because it should is. Okay, well, lonely. Have I done lonely? No, I haven't. No, I have. Lonely is 314. Isn't it? Yeah, lonely calm is 314. And that's the primary counter offer. Is that the same as mine? Yeah, it is. But the first only 4 metatype 13. My naming convention is actually broken, but anyway, I still continue to use it. Relax, sad. Shy relief. It must be shy relief. Then must be actually the correct permutation. No, that doesn't work. What is relaxed, sad? No, I guess does it work? I was just trying. I'm so bad at making notes. Shy, relieved. Where is this? Terrified, lonely. It's supposed to be terrified, lazy. No, it's supposed to be lonely. Why did I write this down here? That's weird. Oh no, that's why. Oh no, that is correct. Relieved. And I just did this. Relieved, relaxed. What is relieved, relaxed? Come on, where did I write it? No, I don't have it written. Getting tired. Relieved, relaxed is 9485, which is framed by three 311. They're lonely calm. So Tamas is actually it's a different order, because, and let's write this out simply so I'm not tricking myself. So first lonely 4 is 311, and 1015 is 716 in the primary counter offer, 311 in the stimulus. What am I? I am, in the stimulus, I'm 16.7. The stimulus, I'm, no, that's not the stimulus. No, it is. Yes, that is actually different. Unless you say that it's framed by only the lowest dimension. It still doesn't line up. Oh wait, are they both the same? So 17.6 calm. And what is 17.6? 17.6 would be framed by 7 and 3. Or, it's probably ambiguous. 17.6 is 16.7. Oh, calm is 16.7. The primary counter offer. No, it's the stimulus is the problem. And both stimulus is 8594. They both have the same signature. What is 8594? Is framed by 3 and 11. Yeah. Right? It's framed by 3. And 11. Unless you were to say that it's framed by 7. Going both ways by 7. Oh, you could do that. Just say it's framed by 7. A solitary frame. You could always describe anything as being framed by one member of the final 5. So that's a bit of a cop-out. the idea is that it's emanated by the cross coincidental drive of two sides of two elements that are corrupting each other, in their two elements of on the throne, somewhat confusing each other or something like that. But I feel like I'm missing something. What am I missing? This is the same as the stimulus of the first lonely four is the same as the primary counter offer of the first anxious two. It's just swapped around. One of them is the odd one out. I need to reconcile this. Anyway, too tired. I'm over it. Defeated by clerical work. This is embarrassing. Okay, so I already attempted to make a recording that covers this kind of subject matter, and it wasn't too bad, but it was a bit too sloppy, and I've used that as an ingredient to think about the whole topic more, and realized that I really need to address more multiple facets of this issue. But and in doing so, I think I came up with a better way of explaining and presenting this entire topic. So, and the fruit of which is essentially the heading, which I do think is actually quite ingenious. So it's sort of the philosophy of beauty and morality of dread, because that is the overarching solution, is actually that what is beautiful is the sensitivity of dread, is the via negativa. That is the actual stable, let's say, quantity of beauty, which is a kind of also transcendental beauty, because it's not grounded in the participatory realm, which is, beauty is this ephemeral thing because it's something that you participate in. So if you're just observing it constantly, then you're actually sort of transfixing yourself into actually the mesmerization of being hypnotized by the great serpent of the world itself, or something like that. You're finding, in fact, I shouldn't say great serpent. It's more like the red dragon in Revelation, the scarlet dragon. Excuse me. You are intimating your own superego child function in the controlling functions of the metaphor that the environment, so you're sort of you're feeling this affinity with a structure of control, and you're in fact concocting an interpersonal entity. You're creating a collective identity, and in some sense this is what the iniquity of the dragon, of the which is one of the reservoirs of the unclean spirits that make up the false ego complex, as being housed in the superego and projected onto the false ego, which make it false. But which essentially what that amounts to is the reversal of the crucifixion, the involution of the crucifixion, a collective crucifixion, the idea that you're going to have a kind of vicarious redemption, in that your whole community is virtually crucifying itself, and you just have to be a cog in that machine. So you become part of an interpersonal crucifixion, while you get to enjoy your personal iniquity instead of taking it with you to your cross. And the thing that we should share with other people, is the same spirit, the same understanding, the same style of taking our own snake with us to the cross, so that when we are resurrected, we are free of the internal serpent, and then we can participate in the participatory domain as we should, as a net zero, because the world itself is actually a zero. It isn't actually, it is a medium, but that medium is conquered and overcome by discerning, in that, and let me even quote from the Gita, you have to be able to see the action in inaction and the inaction in action. You have to discern these things for yourself, as it were. And then we are led by the Spirit, and the law is written on our heart. But that is essentially, everything is grounded in the subconscious. It's grounded in the perspectival belief. And the central belief is the belief in God, essentially, which is accords to a doctrine and a faith in terms of how your mind, the propositional faculty, is structured in a kind of culture of humility, and being able to be sensitive also to that which is of a same and of a different spirit, which you are seeing as you peer through and pierce the veil of the unconscious, of the participatory realm. So you're having a completely spiritual interaction, as it were. But that also means that in certain contexts, in certain scenarios, you are in a mixed up context. There is karmic energy in your midst. And contextually, overcoming the world doesn't mean that you get to kind of pontificate and everything else just kind of automatically that is of the world necessarily surrenders to your dominion, as it were, over it. That's not what overcoming the world is. It's more transcendental than that. And so this mystery of beauty is a deep spiritual mystery which is fraught with danger. And as I said, the thing that actually should ground all of it is via negativa, which is grounded in the subconscious perspective. Now, there are so many things that this relates to that are worth going over, just to kind of bolster that general layout that I've just given an overview of. Because there are, let's say, complicated matters that are worth their own treatment, or sort of seeing how this motif that I've just gone over plays out. So there is something like pedagogy, which is something like, I've spoken to it in other recordings. I think I have, unless it was in the one that I'm not going to upload, because this is the displacement of it, where I talk about the red pulver solaris. And you could even talk about alchemy itself, potentially. But which you could say, is it like a dry run for getting a preemptive vision or scope as to the temerity and the courage that one requires in order to go through the technology of the crucifixion. To start to anticipate what dread your subconscious is going to have to acclimate itself towards in order for it to unlock its full potential and actually be engaged in life, and not a false self-deception about its own grounding, or a mystification about its own grounding. So, a kind of a proper forthright endorsement of one's own beliefs and the proper structure of those values. And, a large contingent of that is faith, essentially. But what that means in practical terms is also that the other sides of the mind are doing their part in conformity with this overarching collaboration between the sides of the mind, as it were, that you are properly internally integrated towards this spirit of integrity, which ends up sort of being an emergent and transcendent sort of thing that can be shared and transmitted uh, uh, between people who are operating from the same, let's call it constitution, spiritual constitution, the same spiritual character. So one of the mysteries in this or whatever is that your propositional structure really does have to be the same. As there can only be one identity that overcomes the world, the only begotten Son. This is why it's important that we share the life in the same, in that same identity. And so, if we can't sort of understand that we have the same identity, then there is a lack of internal cohesion between the sides of the mind, but also that there is something in the superego which is not transparent to ourselves, is opaque, and so we're still in the midst of the false prophet, essentially. Um, Now, and this is why there's no substitute for the crucifixion, the individual crucifixion, because without that self cleansing process, the problem with the unconscious side of the mind is that you have to work out a general solution to the problem, and then you also need a particular solution to your personal problem, because you also have a personal problem that is related to the unconscious. And that personal problem has to do with your particular superego. The iniquity, but you can call that sort of, it's somewhat related to original sin. And you really have to burden that yourself, as you also burden the sins of the world, because that's the only way that you can capture it. So the only way to capture your individual snake, as it were, that's in your own super ego, is that if you burden all the sins of the world in totality, so then you can actually self-heal your own super ego, as it were. But you kind of have to have also the correct solution, because you see the general solution also has to be enough to actually pay for the particular specific solution in your case. So it's almost like a kind of cosmic behaviorism. You actually have to do the right thing out of faith, and then give and it will be given, is sort of the is the promise that God grants us, essentially. That is harvested from the doing the will of God, and actually serving, and actually believing in God, like actually forthrightly in terms of your own subconscious perspectival structure. So the importance of the independence of the subconscious as essentially, because in some weird sense we can say, okay, well, everything is actually grounded in the superego, but you actually do have to take it seriously that the subconscious is an independent ground floor of everything. And that is sort of like that's scripturally resonant with the idea that we all have our race to run. In some sense, that's the thing that receives the crown of glory, is the embodied, incarnated subconscious. That actually does have to have the true belief. Now, how that truth manifests in terms of the propositional humility and the technology of the crucifixion, because eventually the crucifixion doesn't stop happening. When it happens cleanly, it just allows you to constantly operate in the participatory realm, and you can see, let's say, the character of the spiritual agents that are behind all the activities, as it were. You can discern through what's going on, because you're very conscious of your own emanation, as it were. Um, I mean, there can still be slight ambiguities, but essentially, then your propositional antennae can be used to kind of uh, grapple with the other kind of spiritual agents at work, and also, you can see how far apart you are from dealing with other spiritual identities that are not the same identity as yourself. So literally, the exercise then is essentially is some kind of unity of the faith, and unity that it's one crucifixion. There's only one begotten, the only begotten Son. There's one Christ consciousness only. And so, it really does become, because you might be slandered, oh, you think that you're a demigod. So, okay, well, then let's actually see, who actually has the full account of all these things. Let's actually see who has the full grasp of all these things. And essentially, then you are debating doctrine or something like that. Now, there are false doctrines in the world, and which, in the sense that I'm trying to talk about them, can generally be regarded as sort of as developmental obstacles or strategies of organizing one's internal psychological schema, or structures of psychological management for your internal state. And there are probably about 5 strategies. One of them is Christianity, and the others are not, essentially. And it's interesting because the ones that are not are sort of, they rank order in sophistication, because in some sense it's sort of like there are basic pedagogical steps that have not been graduated from, or there are multiple non-graduated steps that then have kind of developed a complex or a sympathetic codependency between each other. And this, I think, is how, for example, I was thinking about this recently, and starting to get into detailed taxonomies of cerebral histrionic and what I've referred to as demigods, and also narcissism. And although I haven't worked up to borderline yet, I have a feeling, in the same way, that demigods are kind of a composite that includes. They're probably also a bit of a spectrum of different sorts of demigods. Um, anyway, the whole sort of demigod quagmire of spiritual complexity, and because it really is a deep spiritual problem, that is a developmental obstacle that in some form everyone has to contend with and eke through and get it into an absolute state, so that its paradox can be grasped and then essentially solved for, but not solving the paradox, using it as a kind of, as a way to escape and transcend over the entire structure. And art can do this, sort of taking beauty to its limits, and then showing that essentially it's the intelligence undergirding it that is actually the real treasure. It is actually the real spiritual treasure. That it's the dread, essentially. Um, because then you can actually get a handle on the dread. You can actually freely work out a prescription of beliefs and values that overcome the dread, whereas you can never overcome a set of principles which are propounded on via positiva, because then that's just an unbounded mystery search. So you are literally treating the unconscious, you're treating the participatory domain as if it actually contains God, except except it doesn't. It only contains idolatry and, images of karmic energy or hypothetical imagined contexts, which in some sense sort of stultify the propositional emergence into a stable and solid navigation of its own purpose. Okay, so see, I'm talking about things, and I don't want to get too hard to follow. Maybe I should take there's so many things that I want to clean up there, but it's going to get more fragmented perhaps for some listeners. So let me just say that the problem with beauty is that, and I can only frame it like this as a prescription, is that beauty, because I'm framing it as a principle, but you have to work out what the awareness of darkness is that undergirds this rationale. So I'm proposing a rationale, I'm proposing a principle, but you have to work out what are the values that are emanating this principle, as it were. What is the action in this inaction and the inaction in this action, which the rationale infers and inducts or induces, if it were to be used, if it were to be tried out, if you were to essentially try to emulate the spirit, try the spirits whether they are of God, is that beauty must be contained in something that you are participating in. It must be in the immediate verb, as it were. It must be in your immediate participation thereof. And I think that, because otherwise, if you try to generalize beauty into beautiful objects that are intrinsically beautiful or something like that the beauty is something that is contained externally to the understanding or externally to the eye of the beholder, to the spiritual discerning of that, the spiritual eye of the beholder must be the thing that provides the beauty or ascribes the beauty, is the source of the beauty, the source of the authority in the beauty. And if you want to sort of say, oh no, but that's because there's a hidden truth there. Yes, it is mysterious. But I'm saying that the source of that mystery is bound up in the understanding or in the unrendered or unfully conscious understanding. So you have a quasi-understanding, or you have an unjustified understanding, or it's not really an understanding, quite frankly, if it's in that state. So you have work to do. But you can see this quite clearly, because, if you let's just say that you are surrounded by beautiful things, and you constantly increase this experience of being surrounded by more and more beautiful things, and more of your time is spent by being immersed in external things around you that reflect to you beauty. So, I would argue that what is happening to your, let's say, your apperception of dread is your understanding of dread, is it, are you going to be more sensitive, therefore, to things that you don't find beautiful, because the status quo is that you are used to being pleased. And I do think that there is also something in modern culture, as it were, or maybe it's to do with consumerism, or maybe it's to do with, I wanted to get into, I should have been talking about narcissism. So this is actually somewhat parallel to the whole sort of spiritual strategy of narcissism. Which is really to do with solipsism. Is that you want the participatory realm to be fundamentally a reflection of the world's mind, and you want the world's mind to be good because you are just a denizen thereof. So you're somewhat entracted into a commitment to collective responsibility, and you are just going to be a nobleman within this general project. You're going to be a local satrap. That anything within your purview, you're going to represent the moral authority of the collective cosmic truth that the participatory realm is like a total reflection thereof. The idea that this is collectively the kingdom under heaven. We can use the Chinese formulation of the Chinese empire. And this is essentially because then you can see yourself as a tentatively as a sovereign or as a king. To have aesthetic sensibilities which mean that you don't actually have to justify your understanding, you just need to confabulate or minimize, or you can be allergic to responsibility within the unconscious domain, and you don't have to propositionally contend with this in any kind of serious way. You can propositionally contend with it on an ad hoc basis. It doesn't have to be any kind of internal coherence, because as long as it makes sense according to the stricture or the contextual environmental rules, there is no law, essentially. The law is your tact in being able to promulgate an ad hoc rationalization to make the participatory realm seem I'm sorry, I'm not titling these things so the flow is going that well, but this is all relevant. You see this Saturday, this is such a huge topic. But so what am I talking about? I'm talking about that there are multiple strategies to try to seemingly stabilize or to at least tread water within the gambit of the myriad or the particular set of developmental obstacles. And the central theme of all of them is that they work out some kind of supplementary or substitution for integrity. So they have either a supplementary token, which they derive as an external locus of control or as some kind of participatorily grounded substance. So they are fundamentally locked into being orientated and directed from the participatory medium. Now, arguably, anyone could be argued to be doing that. They just have different strategies of doing it. Even the transcendental strategy could be say, okay, well, you're still tethered to it. And then, and then the argument about whether it's not being anchored in it, but still being connected with it, but not of it, is an ephemeral kind of argument to make. So, it's such a slight change in disposition relative to the ways of the world, um, that it might seemingly go undetectable, because the spiritual excellence is disguised in the earthen vessel. But that also that the victory might be so slight, that you can actually be employed and do your job and go home with your wage. And in some sense, it's relevant what expression you were wearing on your face. Is that either way, the integrity is sound and protected in the earthen vessel, to be seen or to be unseen, depending on the eye of the beholder. And in some sense, if people, I don't think, care to probe what is the dread which is actually being managed, which is actually being spiritually confronted in the activities or in the participatory behavior, you don't know that unless you delve into the propositional structure. Many people, though, I think, if their propositional structure is orientated purely towards ostensibly or nonsensically being grounded in the participatory realm itself, then they are just kind of a zombie. But if they are perhaps not even in that, they are naively in their perspectival subconscious, sort of battling with the glass ceiling of the participatory and thinking that the propositional is just is a post hoc afterthought, rather than it's part of the perspectival articulation of the self, of the identity which you can pay for by your crucifixion, if you do the crucifixion. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that what even the crucifixion itself in Scripture, when it's described, is said that how strange it looked to the onlookers. Because I think it was emanating these this the spiritual resonance of the snake that had been taken to the cross, and the dread, the knowledge of the dread was essentially being radiated from in a kind of, for those who might have had a spiritual sensitivity to propositionally see the reflection of their own paradox, which was also being bound to the one who was silent before his accusers. That you see the resolution of these things, but when you look upon the crucifixion, you're not going through the crucifixion yourself. You're looking at it from the other side. So in some sense, if you see that dread as beautiful, if you see that propositional dread as beautiful, you are doing a reverse crucifixion. And that reverse crucifixion is the curse of the Holy Ghost on the spirit of man. That is the Holy Spirit. That curse is the Holy Spirit. And that is what I've generally, I don't know if it's in the last recordings, that is the red pulvis solaris. It's kind of like a catalyst for seeing the thing that you would have to propositionally have the courage to eventually be grounded in your perspectival belief. Because you don't just believe in God, even if you have the faith to want to attempt to do the crucifixion. You don't just believe in God, you also believe in other nonsense. You believe in other magical thinking. And that will only essentially be purified by the uncovering of the dread to which you're not already sensitized. Because that is essentially how you are adding to the chaos in the participatory realm. But you only get access to that, to seeing that, once you have the courage to be accountable for all of it, as it were. And you actually have the propositional tool that actually does take account for all of it. Because and then in the resurrection, that you actually know that personally, and then that gets given from the general solution of the propositional to the specific solution of the perspectival, the particular solution. So you go from the general solution to the particular solution, which then you know the truth. So you go from doctrinal faith to personal belief. And that there's a basic connection between those things. And the thing that links them is the crucifixion. But it's a personal crucifixion, it's not a vicarious one. Anyway, now it bears going into the strategies that are not this, that circumvent this because they are doing other things instead. And so they are misleading themselves and others. Because they come up with false doctrine. They come and they're trying to cultivate followers with itching ears and all those sorts of things. Is that now? I think that what demigods are doing is that they are giving sympathy to cerebral histrionics, and they want to create a boys' club. They want to create a treehouse club for a whole lot of little children, including themselves, as they can generalize their sympathy and try to inculcate themselves under this umbrella, this collective umbrella, where they're going to become a collective narcissist. So together they can be solipsistic. Together they're allowed to collectively be solipsistic. I realize that that's slightly oxymoronical, but and in some sense I think that what they have done is they have looked at narcissism, they've looked at narcissists, they've intuitively worked out what the different strategies of going along to get along in the world are, and they've looked at they've intuitively outlined these different strategies, and they've just kind of daisy chained them together. They've just kind of created an alchemical chimera. Now, I think that there is a value in creating this kind of alchemical chimera as a ritual, as an attempt to actually fail on purpose, as a dry run for giving people the insight as to the absolute apex of, there's a beautiful example of this in the What If animated series, which is all stories to do with the MCU. And it's all about the Watcher. The first season is only, I think, 9 episodes or something. And it has this is going to be a bit of a spoiler, and it has a beautiful kind of arc within the whole season. And I think essentially the Watcher is the Holy Ghost. It's dangerous to say things, to give an artistic sort of thing, but you see, because to explore this thing, you have to kind of explore it theosophically, and then you have to basically say, well, you realize why this is forbidden, and why these metaphors don't work. But it's kind of because you never actually understand the Holy Ghost. The Word is the understanding. And you operate spiritually. You don't operate in the realm of the Holy Ghost. But anyway, that's also kind of part of the kind of philosophical theme which is being explored in this animated series. But essentially, if you can understand that there's a Doctor Strange in the season, and Doctor Strange is the via negativa, he is the apostle of understanding the Holy Ghost. You also see at the end of the series that he is the only friend of the Watcher, essentially, in some way. Although the Watcher never confirms this. But this Doctor Strange, he destroyed his whole universe. And he did it what? He destroyed it because of via positiva, because for love. So he knows he unlocked the absolute mystery. He took it to the absolute. He said, "Oh, okay, love actually destroys everything in the end. Look at the action in action, the action in inaction, and the inaction in action. That when you are acting for love, that your inaction has caused a kind of weight and burden and dread that has destroyed everything, because he had via positiva, but he didn't have the dread." Okay, anyway, he didn't have the real, but he was left with that at the end, because I guess because he didn't die, because he was the only thing left alive in his whole universe, and he was all alone. That he's almost like the spiritual antithesis of the bad guy, who actually the bad guy, they called him the Sovereign. Which is actually exactly like a narcissist, as well. But I think I don't want to go into that metaphor because it's going to be way too abstract and weird. Anyway, what can I say? Okay, so let me get away from that example, and let me just make it. Let's talk about sex. Okay, so anatomically, our species, which is made in the image of God, has two genders. It's going to be, but both genders are orientated around judging the same metric, which is essentially tracking what is after his kind. It's arguable as well. Each side of the mind perhaps has its own different, within the human condition, if I can put it like that, has its own different spiritual strategy of reproduction. And the unconscious really is a problematic one, because that is the one that is based on the herd mentality. So that one propagates or procreates after their kind. So the unconscious is bound into a kind of sociological paradox. It's fundamentally got this mesmerizing quality to it. And so, but you can still have your cake and eat it, let's just say, by using it as a medium, but essentially spiritually transcending that medium and treating it eventually as a zero. But how that manifests is going to be peculiar to your subconscious plotting within the participatory realm. So although we all have the same propositional style and intelligence, at least if properly cultivated and pedagogically developed and spiritually, let's say, integrated, um, the actual incarnated grounding and then the use of our beliefs, which are going to be contextually accessed according to our earthen vehicle. But if you have enough beliefs, then essentially you can still ground everything in an internal locus. You're not taking coordinates from the participatory realm and placing it into the spirit, into the identity. The identity is dressing itself. And if I can use the analogy, is fundamentally okay with allowing itself to be naked. And I mean that as a spiritual metaphor, so that's not to be taken literally. Um, and the thing that is actually wearing the clothing is the propositional, in terms of how it's being diplomatic in its negotiation and exchanges or transmission with hopefully the same identity. Ideally speaking. Obviously, the identity of that intelligence being the only begotten Son. That's part of the belief that then makes that a decent. I'm not saying that we should all be the same just so that we're all the same. I'm not saying that we should all just be Agent Smith. The point is actually to be all the only begotten Son. I'm making a slight Matrix reference, so it's so a lot of these sort of demigod people, I think, are essentially trying to create an Agent Smith kind of program, but they haven't vetted or actually gone through the contestation of vetting their model of their Agent Smith with against ulterior schemas, essentially, and nor are they quite interested to do so. They're not interested in the iron sharpening iron. They are quite self-satisfied, and they consider that also to be a metric of their own solipsistic superiority, because they have enough anchorage. Their dragon in their superego has enough anchorage in the participatory realm to create a full circle sort of nest for itself. And I do think essentially that they are just trying to create a compatible linkage of dragon temperaments. What's the other point? Is that but if you have some awareness of the crucifixion from a kind of from a spiritual edifice, then I think that essentially when you see how the world lieth in wickedness and how it is constructed in this web, you can perhaps see how some forms of fleshly thinking, if they were perhaps just modulated slightly, um, or engaged with or communicated with, might precipitate a state in which you get the sort of the assisted brainwashing. Where the scales can fall from the eyes and you can sort of see a window of escape from the never-ending mysteries of the participatory realm and the resolution of mystery, which is also directly invoked in Revelation. And the mystery shall be finished. The mystery of God shall be finished, it says. So the propositional understanding is important. And it does depend on a belief in God, or it is in conjunction with a belief in God. But the understanding must essentially take the full weight of the sins of the world. It must take that project seriously so that it can actually generate the fruit of the resurrection, essentially, which is the vindication of the Spirit. Which is also the understanding. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in the subconscious it's the spirits, in the propositional it's the understanding. But the Spirit has an understanding, essentially. It's probably technically wrong to exactly conflate them, but at least within the context of the false ego complex, before the crucifixion has taken place, I think that they must essentially be regarded as the same thing. Because that is the proximate, let's say, spiritual obstacle that needs to be resolved or solved for or developed or cultivated. That is the conduit for the later vista of reconciliation with truth. Anyway, I didn't finish the thing about the sex. Okay, so sex is generally symbolic of marriage, man and a woman becoming one flesh, and the flesh is the fleshly thinking which obscures the understanding of the propositional structure. So you could say it's something like the iniquity that falls into the question which is being contained in the understanding of the inferior function, in the ego, in the propositional. So, like, this embodiment of sexual energy and enacting these sorts of things, there is a spiritual version of this, which could be something like art and creativity and ritual. And in some sense, the spiritual version of this is impersonal, which also means that it's doomed to fail. Um, because essentially what makes it fundamentally impersonal is that it only functions through a constructive collective entity. You're creating an interpersonal organization or membership of a group. And you're saying that this is one flesh. Now, unless that is actually happening on the level of one-to-one interactions and exchanges, and the transmission of understanding and digestion of understanding, if it's supposedly happening as a constructive interpersonal entity that isn't actually being actively, immediately participated in, now all of this is not necessarily bad. This is like practice for your crucifixion. Because what is essentially happening here is, in this joining of the flesh, you are multiplying the capacity to solve mysteries by tapping the powers of multiple individuals. So that is what a real communion is. But if you're just doing the ritual of communion, if you're just doing some kind of, and because you want to say that it's beautiful or something like that, no, if it's not immediately being participated in, and essentially the beauty is connected with the apperception of the garnering, or let's say the increase in understanding dread that is actually driving the because I do think that beauty is the obverse of what is to be understood by dread. Sort of engaging in the joy of experiencing beauty. I mean, I guess I'm reducing this into quite a harsh stoicism, essentially, where you are detaching from the via positiva and grounding this in a kind of resolute Now, I do think that there's a play to be had, but the play to be had is when you are overtly engaging in a constructive scenario which is a reflective, performative simulacra of morality or ethics. I mean, I prefer games that are essentially have politics involved in them, because then essentially they can be used as an example of meta ethics. That how people manage themselves and comport themselves, and then that gives, they're kind of like life simulators to some extent, or they're simulators of some mystery, and then that gives you the opportunity to share insight or share differences of using the metaphor of the game. You can essentially do the iron sharpening iron. And this also perhaps gives a metaphor which is, it makes it easier to make light of somebody else, which is to say, um, to unveil to them the scope of their recurring pattern of self-deception or something like that. Is to find a way to help them laugh with you about some laugh is probably not true in this kind of circumstance, because it would be more like to appreciate, to wryly appreciate the gap in terms of the application of one's intelligence to achieving a purpose, or at least in how the purpose is even potentially constructed to begin with, and that there's some kind of inconsistency or self-deception there. Anyway, I'm jumping around a bit, but so everything can be seen as a metaphor of something. A game, at least, because of a particular structure in terms of how the game is played, can make it easier or harder to elucidate or to bring to the fore or to emphasize the structure or style of the intelligence that is being applied in order to play it. So anyway, I mean, this is... So in my view, I see games and playing around in some sense as a kind of, as a form of communion that is metaphorically bounded in some ways within some subset of meta-ethics, or some subset, or however the game is particularly structured. Well, it's not really the game itself potentially, but it's how the game is played by its participants, I guess, or by the players, and then those qualities about their fundamental constitutional character is revealed, and then is also revealed to be potentially negotiated with or engaged with or communicated about. And so there's a meta-ethical layer of or at least a potential of iron sharpening iron. Anyway, this, I think, as people playing more games than they have in the past, perhaps, for other cultural reasons, have perhaps allowed for people to I don't exactly know what I want to say about this, but has allowed people to wear their developmental failings on their sleeve, which is both good and bad. I think what it has fundamentally done is it has meant that people are more stable in their stasis, in their static death of their lack of progress or development. It becomes harder for them to convince themselves that they aren't essentially stuck in a rut. But it also I think that something happens that's quite special when the world stands still for people, because in their own way they see is the word apogee. They see at least the zenith of their own folly, potentially, or at least it's there for them to have sight on it. It's there for them to make a conclusion about it when the world stands still. That's why, some of these strategies of coping are so problematic, because the ones that deal in a kind of complexity or a complex of multiple sympathy codependency between different, it's kind of a composite of different psychopathologies, are when people are essentially constructively trying to together build a kind of virtual narcissism together. I don't think it's exactly an inexhaustible project which you can continually try to strive at, and therefore, because I do think that at some point it will, the more it's progressed and the more it's perfected, the more it will perhaps give evidence of its own sort of feeble re-stimulation of its own structure of drama, that that it keeps on sort of, the more success it has, the more overtly pathological I think it manifests as. But so in some sense, I think one of the worst way, or one of the easiest ways to overcome these things is to sort of wish them success and actually hope that they actually do achieve success, because the faster they achieve success, the faster they accelerate towards their own they end up creating enough of a mess that other people can get cold feet, as it were. And that's partly because the curse of the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, is continually providing this sort of the source of the worm of doubt, the source of developing via negativa dread about the project, that there's an endemic self-doubt, which is that truly belongs to the spirit of man. Uh, because the crucifixion does work. But sadly, that can also average out into this horrible, homogenized, sort of protracted Holy Spirit involution, where you keep on trying to concoct some kind of diversionary collective crucifixion or vicarious redemption. Anyway, this recording has gone on for long enough. I should probably regroup and try work out how to properly talk about communion, sexual energy, and the different sides of the mind in relation to procreation and sort of the spiritual analogy of that in terms of the gift of the deacon and the proper use of the red pulvis solaris, or the reverse of the crucifixion as a dry run for the crucifixion, as essentially as a way to proselytize or evangelize or to testify about the doctrine and testify the gospel. But I do think that has been the problem, is that they just haven't had the right doctrine, or and there's so much false doctrine that it just which is also perhaps why in these modern times, as the world moves towards standing still, um, these things can be better understood and captured, perhaps. Or, I mean, by people or not, but then at least they will suffer the consequences of their spiritual nescience or bad faith. For loving the darkness and not seeking the kingdom. Anyway, the most important thing is, I guess, not to generalize these things, but to see how they operate upon and within individual people, and not talk about sociological structures so much. I don't know if I should be making this recording yet, but I just want to go back and start cleaning up some of the issues that I waded into, because I think that there's a nice synthesis to be had and a refinement of these issues. So, and I think it relates to this kind of red pulvis solaris. So I just want to contextualize this more precisely as to the legitimacy of that kind of spiritual mechanic. And essentially, I think the reason why it is like a good spiritual ingredient for a catalyst and why it relates to the gift of the deacon essentially is because, which is symbolically, if you analogize the body of Christ into human anatomy, it is the deacon, the gift of the deacon is the reproductive organ essentially, or the procreative sexual organ. And essentially, the sexual act itself, I do think, is the physical embodiment of what I've described as red pulvis solaris, which is something like the joining of the flesh or making one flesh. You know, the actual the marriage, the consummation of the marriage. Uh, into a unitary body. So in some sense, the sexuality of that is symbolized by the gift of the deacon is within itself. It's not to another. It's essentially saying we are already of one flesh or something like that. And then there's a dance or something like that. Our propositional egos are already, or let's say, destined to be in alignment or something like that. And then that's sort of being participatorily, ritualistically unfolded or something like that. But this is the mystery of beauty in some sense, and the spiritual mystery of beauty is a very, very dangerous one because you can come to the wrong conclusion. And you know, it's interesting. I've been listening to people talk about beauty, and I don't know if it was in the Jordan Peterson Joe Rogan thing or elements of that with other people discussing it with Paul Vanderklay about beauty, the Maryland discussing beauty with Paul Vanderklay. But I mean, I've been thinking about this because I mean, you know, I do think that this is deeply problematic, or this whole topic is fraught with much danger. So let me just technically lay down my understanding of this topic. Essentially, is that beauty is only ever participated in. It cannot be objectified in some pristine sense, which is why essentially it's dangerous to sort of make beautiful idols because or things that supposedly contain beauty, because the only thing that is providing the beauty is the participation of a sentient agent, which is lending the dignity of the sentient agent to what is a constructively, tentatively, or speculatively projected, or let's say, you know, the anticipation that there is going to be a an interpersonal entity that will actually amount to there being a single ego, a single flesh, so that, you know, we are just participatorily, we have the same propositional structure, but it inhabits two different participatory units. So we are separate, but we are also the same in terms of the quality and the condition of the propositional um, processing that we do. So we are in different uh, uh, areas of the participatory field, but we give each other the same propositional mm, merit or virtue, and we see that virtue reflected. And so, in some sense, in the participatory domain, when we are participating in something that resonates with that kind of egoic, transcendental, transplanting correspondence or concurrence, then we can call that beautiful. And we can even also say that animals that are not sentient can approximately, seemingly do the same thing as us, you know, in the sexual metaphor. Um, you know, you get a taxonomy of this in Genesis, you know, where um, oh, you must forgive me if I slip some of this up, but essentially it actually creates different categories. So, for example, herd animals multiply after their kind, and creeping things and other types of animals multiply after his kind. What does it mean to procreate in the direction after his kind or after their kind? Well, if you're a herd animal, you know, how you're being the selective pressure in a herd animal is not strictly speaking correspondent to the pair bond. It's also restricted by, let's say, group dynamics and group utility and social structure or whatever. So you're being selected in the sexual selection within the species. What is beautiful to the animal is after their kind, is that you're being judged in terms of how well you are hitting the target that and the target is what the target is chasing. The target is chasing what is after their kind. So if you are an outlier, if you're an outlier to their kind, then you're judged as deficient. Whereas creeping things and mammals that are just have smaller, that aren't in herds, essentially, that perhaps have other structures. I mean, perhaps I wonder, certain mammals that have packs. I don't know if a pack is exactly a herd. Um, I guess it probably is more distinguishable in terms of if there's just one alpha male that actually breeds, or if it's how many different sort of breeding partners there are. But if there are multiple breeding partners, um, or breeding units, as it were, then the 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 beauty standard is decentralized, and essentially what is being selected for is after the individual, after his kind. And so both the male and the female gender roles are both, in some sense, judging the biological um, male sex, which means also that because they're both doing this. So first of all, men actually have to compete, as it were, and women, or the female, has to judge. So the selective pressure is that women will um, have a higher threshold of I mean, you can see the contradictions in feminist kind of theory and stuff like that, is that women never tolerate being judged in the same way that they judge men. So that they are completely beholden to differential standards. um, in some sense, their whole basic inclination um, is to judge men, and they want that respected about their feminism. They want that normalized, but they don't want the same standards being applied to them. The same standards of judgment that they leverage against men, they don't want. It doesn't go both ways or whatever, and that's because essentially the common project between both gender roles is targeting after his kind. But there are two strategies of achieving that, where the biological male actually has to um, bring home the bacon or whatever, and the biological female has to judge the quality of the produce. And so there's a differential. Anyway, and and this can be generalized also, in just a more spiritual metaphysic of between the spirit and the soul, that the active force is the thing that is essentially judged, but it is viewed within the lens of the reservoir, in the container of the soul, in which it manifests an effect. So the feminine container contains the content which is judged at how well it in terms of how fulfilling it is, or whatever, or how judges the effect of the thing that is bounded by the by that framework of judgment. And so women are much better at fielding other people's judgments to incorporate into their own. They assimilate things much better. They assimilate the lay of the land, the field, much more broadly and widely, because they are specialized to judge objects within the field, whereas men are specialized to try to increase the content of the field, or to so the field is defined by the produce constructed by his kind. But but obviously the woman then representing more of the selective pressure itself, or the actual judgment itself, is having an inductive hand over containing and framing the entire enterprise, because even though you can generally say that it's after his kind, the tracking or the chasing after is going to implicitly, if the thing that is looking after can't follow where it's going, then it might as well be lost if it can't be found, or something like that. So it has to sort of stay in view of the thing that is looking after or tracking after his kind. So the object that is being tracked is the spirit, is the masculine, which is metaphorically the masculine. Anyway, but the converse is completely true as well, because it's not as if women can't be judged, and it's not as if men as well can't also judge. It's just that sort of biologically there is a kind of lowest common denominator. We could call it inbred propensity for this, but the more that we kind of metaphorically access it, the more the hermetic understanding of this produces a window for a transcendental synthesis, or a transposed understanding, which becomes a single understanding. Anyway. Because how much better it is to be able to produce when you have a decent understanding of the thing that is following after and tracking the thing that is done in his after his kindness. If you can have an anticipation of how it will be received, as it were. But obviously, anticipation that also has a troubling element in it, potentially, because if you hypothetically model that and you are running that hypothetical, then that becomes a substitution for life itself and experience itself, and it becomes a diversion, which is essentially archetypally, I would say, connected to the knowledge of good and evil, and the idea that you can camouflage yourself in that hypothetical modeling, or that imaginary substitution of life itself, substitution of the tree of life. Anyway, so this is the problem, is that beauty is always immediate participation. As soon as you try to conceptualize it, it essentially has already become quasi-dangerous. It might not be dangerous yet, but it has the potency of deep danger depending on how it's treated or how it's depended on or leaned on in lieu of an actual understanding that is spiritually dignified and sound, as it were. Okay, so, okay, maybe, have I completed this thought about beauty? So, in my view, the only way that beauty actually has any utility is that you are, in some sense, doing some kind of ritual. You are embodying a mystery. You are collectively embodying a mystery because you're collectively testing it out. And you shouldn't be, in some sense, this is always falling short because this is an attempt to have a failure. In some sense, if you're doing this, you are attempting to fail, and but it's also good if you consciously doing that, or at least if you're in the process of realizing that you're just attempting to make a failure, um, because that is the door to the transcendence out of the unconscious and out of this transfixion and mesmerization into so-called beautiful things, because you can't extricate your own understanding from what is a false entity, which is the constructed interpersonal entity, because there is no constructed interpersonal entity that actually has real dignity, other than the dignity which is being funded to it by independent understandings, independent propositional individuals that have the same condition of understanding. But the idea that you're going to actually reify the interpersonal entity and say, oh, it's good that we're doing this ritualistic mystery and we're reenacting this mystery, that only has utility in the potential pedagogy. In some sense, you are trying to teach the collective. You're doing something to teach the collective about how close and far you can get to embodying something as problematic as decentralized collective intelligence. So it's a meditation on the problem of collective decentralized intelligence. So it's sort of, you could say it's an attempt to have a single flesh, um, in some real collective sense, which is effectively impossible, because the thing that actually accomplishes this is the same understanding. But you're stress testing. It's like a dry run. You're doing a dry run so that you know that you're all on the same page. So that when you all fail at the dry run because it was destined to fail, you all then know that you have the same via negativa understanding, essentially. But when you actually think that the ritual is the thing itself, then you are in idolatry or whatever. And so this is the problem with beauty, is that beauty is fundamentally there to be displaced by understanding. The Holy Ghost is not meant to be seen. It's a ghost. It's meant to be dead. Leave the dead things alone. Uh, you live in the Holy Ghost. You don't see the Holy Ghost. The tree of life is in the midst of the New Jerusalem. It's in the midst of, it's right in the middle. You don't live in the park, in the green patch in the middle where the tree is. No one lives there. You live in the actual, in and you work and you function in the actual part of the city, which is displaced from its center, as it were. But and you but you understand that the tree is in the center. That's where the Holy Ghost is, because you don't live in the park. You live in the New Jerusalem, which doesn't even have its own lighting system. It doesn't even have its own natural light. You have to bring your light to the party. And everyone has to bring their own light to the party. the light of God and the light of the Lamb. Otherwise, other people don't know what's happening. Um, anyway, hmm, man, that's too much of a mixed metaphor to make useful connections further. But how do I put it? So I think talking about homosexuality again, essentially, what homosexuality is this? It is this kind of addiction to this red pulvis solaris, into sort of contemplating what a general propositional understanding would look like, but it it's sexualized this. It's contained it within the sexual metaphor and the sexual instinct, and it's trying, essentially, if I can put it like this, and I mean this in the original sense, it is the literal promulgation of a heresy. So it's like, we're going to create a secret clubhouse where we're going to have a secret understanding that really um, subverts the structures and the powers and everybody else's understanding. Um, hmm, how do I put this? I mean, I wonder. I guess I think there could be forms of homosexuality which are quite spiritually advanced and which are quite generous and kind, and that have some view to using this red pulvis solaris to some kind of greater aim or greater good. Um, I guess where it perhaps falls short is when this is, because essentially I think the only value of it is to understand the exhaustibility of the participatory domain, so that you can sort of create this window of transcendence and then actually do the crucifixion the right way, and then heal your own superego, and then uh, in scriptural terms, then everything else will be added, essentially. And what happens after that is essentially is a kind of divine game, is a kind of participatory joy, and the fruit of the spirit, and peace, joy, and contentment in the Holy Ghost. Essentially, then you can see that the unconscious domain is essentially, you understand it as being, there's no doubt in terms of the distance between the unconscious and the Holy Ghost. It's properly understood. Um, Man, I'm butchering this slightly, but essentially the reason why the homosexuality is a kind of heresy is because instead of healing the superego and using this as a dry run to understand the failure of trying to use the participatory realm as being sufficient to ground the self, or ground the individual, or ground meaning, or ground anything, or ground the conception of God, or whatever, instead of seeing that the unconscious is fundamentally insufficient, and is essentially and must be generally only used as a portal into doing the kind of transcendental transposition of egoic oneness in quality and condition. I must qualify that, because it's not that if everyone were self-realized in terms of their ego, that would they would understand themselves as being able to do that. Um, and obviously, that claim, when you make that general claim, is a kind of divine vanity, I'll say, and it is a divine vanity that you do have to suffer for. That's literally what means that you have to be crucified for it, but you'll be resurrected. Uh, um, and essentially, the fruit of that resurrection is that the same spirit in your propositional, the same understanding in your propositional structure does get vindicated, and that vindication, if there is iniquity within your superego, if you've done enough of the dry run red pulvis solaris, if you've actually correctly via negativa contracted the participatory realm, then you are left with the self-healing fruit of, the leaves of the tree of life that are the healing to the nations, and the greatest nation of all, your imagination. And then you're no longer beholden to the imaginary self-deceit which is going on in the participatory arena. It's interesting because, I think in what I was talking about recently, I had last night, thinking about some of these topics and such, I had this great feeling of unease and disease and dread, and I do think that because I think that in some sense that this has been a process that's been happening before, but I think that through cycling through the four sides of the mind, even after having started doing the crucifixion, that essentially more unclean spirits came out of the mouths of the beast and the dragon and the false prophet. As the propositional understanding grows more rigorous and robust and, let's say, complete in being able to cover the burden, the correct, because paradoxically it also, because you essentially, I think I've got a general solution for the whole four sides of the mind. The general solution is that each side of the mind let me find where I wrote this down. Each side of the mind must be able to bear the weight of the proceeding side of the mind, and also understand the end of its ambit, or how it is bounded, and it needs to be able to sort of countenance that being bound in that sense. So in some sense, at some point, each side of the mind must preempt also the ambit of the proceeding side of the mind, so that its functional understanding doesn't is not disparate with the proceeding side of the mind. And so the subconscious has to preempt the unconscious, and the unconscious has to preempt the ego. Or said another way, the subconscious or the the perspectival understanding and structure has to preempt the participatory understanding and structure, and the participatory understanding and structure has to preempt the propositional. And when the unconscious properly preempts the propositional, it actually has nothing left. There's nothing left. It gets via negativa reduced down to effectively zero, but it is still a medium that it is still a conduit, as it were, but it ends up being a fundamentally hollow conduit. I would even say, paradoxically, it's either hollow of beauty or that it only contains beauty. It's a kind of it must become a kind of absolute binary or something like that. So that that you get out of, when I say an absolute binary, I misspoke. What I mean is that it must be reduced into a binary, and then it must just be within that binary, the one must be completely negated, so that it's only one thing. It needs to be, you need to reduce it to a dichotomy, and then you need to defeat the dichotomy so that it is ultimately completely transcended, and victory is made over it. So it is completely overcome. It needs to be completely overcome, essentially. And so and essentially, I mean, the general answer is that and also completely overcoming it, in some sense, on some level you could say might be a never-ending thing, because otherwise there would be the end of life and experience, and because life and experience continues through that. So how can it change without changing? And which is the same kind of thing as a fractal. A fractal is always the same, but it always looks different. So it has to be like that. So you have to turn it into a formula, and how fractals are made formulaically is they are to the -1 exponent. The exponential. What makes a fractal is that it's some kind of complex set of relations to a -1, and then as you feed perspective into it, then it generates a new rendered or resolved picture, but it's the same. So it's a new picture, but it's the same picture. And so essentially maybe this is too much of a weak argument that I'm using all these mathematical metaphors, but the exponential -1 is what that is via negativa, in that that essentially it's just a medium. It holds no content of its own. It's just a medium of the subconscious perspectival knowledge. And you've got a routing formula that you can reverse engineer the apparition of something. There's slight problems because you can't exactly reverse engineer, because you can't see the whole image, or you can see a local part of the perspective. The whole image is essentially what the Holy Ghost is, and if you could see the whole Holy Ghost, then you would see the world according to the Holy Ghost, which means that you would be able to anticipate the actual rendering of the whole thing. But so the thing is that you are, so how you contain that formula is propositionally, essentially, and how you access that part of the hologram yourself, or that projection yourself, is through the footwork that the local position point within the image is perhaps not even fully recorded within the subconscious. In some sense, that plotting maneuver is done by the superego. Um, so I do think that the superego essentially, it does become a rather, what's the word? A rather still set of faculties. Like, it's a pristine set of things which you can have recourse to, and you don't have problems having recourse to that source of vision, as it were. But it's not it doesn't agitate the ego because the beast is no longer in effect. And the structures in the superego don't anticipate an answer to the unconscious, which is then essentially inverted as just try and I know technically what I want to refer to, but I'm trying to think of how to describe the mechanism that creates it. Or maybe the magical thing here is that it doesn't directly create it. It sort of implicitly creates a disquieting context for the subconscious and the ego, which, because it's a sort of, it exists in a shadow. So it exists without the light of knowing what you are doing to begin with. So because you start off not knowing what it is that you are doing, you're not given an ontological sort of, you're not read your rights or given a full recitation of your whole context, because of just proceeding, because the subconscious had to submerge from that darkness. Did I say submerge? Or it had to proceed out of that darkness. And again, I mean, this is actually parallel to how Genesis describes creation. Um, that the earth was created void and without form, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God, or does it say the face of God, hovered above the waters. I'm getting some of the words slightly wrong. And and evening and morning was the first day, and it's sort of, what is it? Is it only the third day where God creates light? So, I mean, I think that what I was just talking about somewhat parallels to the association of God, authority, integrity with the superego, but sort of only on the third day. The subconscious has access to the light of reason. So I wonder if perhaps I shouldn't even, I'm not even sure which day God creates light on. Perhaps I should go read that, but maybe it's too much to try to see if that can be transposed onto, well, God creates man on the sixth day. I don't know where exactly I should begin, but I was thinking that, sort of the earth created void and without form, It's not going to be in the right order anyway, in terms of if that in a particular incarnation, if that maybe the earth is the dominant function, the superego, and the face of God above the waters, or the Spirit of God um, floating above the waters is something like the relationship between the superego's child function and God, and the parent function is related to the garden and the tree of life, and perhaps also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Those are all the parent function of the superego. But now I've broken the look, there might be some water to what I'm saying, but it's probably not that useful, so let me just jettison that perhaps. But from counting from these objects, you see I'm making it fit too much and it doesn't sort of come naturally. But the sixth thing would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would be the sixth thing is the child function of the subconscious, which is also the sin of the superego. So, if you take the sixth, I think that there is something to this. Potentially. Maybe it's too much of a theosophical speculation. Anyway, what is probably a more stable correlation to these things are the seven churches that are mentioned in Revelation. But I already made this parallel a long time ago. Anyway, what should I say? Yeah, that's a huge diversion. Let me just focus on this red pulver solaris thing. I mean, essentially, the thing that has to mostly be overcome in terms of the unconscious is the idea that the unconscious houses the derivation of causation. That cause and effect is fundamentally reducible to the unconscious side of the mind. When that is displaced by understanding being the actual cause of things, then you have sentience blossoming into free will, or I define sentience as the potential of free will. And I do think that sentience is a divine category. We should treat things, there should be a legal protected status for things that are sentient. And I do think that this doctrine or whatever is related to all sentient life, or somewhat belongs to all sentient life. Although there might be forms of intelligence which might, depending on how you define intelligence, might not contain sentience. But which would essentially be kind of gaming type simulators of agency or something like that. But I was listening to Jordan Peterson have like a 9-minute video, 10-minute video on disciplining children. I did slightly disagree with him. I do think that, you know, the idea that you don't want to be taken down the authority hierarchy by a 2-year-old is, you know, covered by the generally beautiful ascription that you should try to like your children, and so don't let them do things that will make you dislike them, because, you know, you're very powerful and dangerous yourself, and so it's important that you like your children, because otherwise you're going to sadistically abuse them, at least unconsciously, or something like that. All of this is to somewhat avoid giving your child the tool to also unseat unsubstantiated authority and power, which is that, okay, well, I'm looking out for you by giving you restrictions and discipline and regulation because they're things that you don't understand. But if you can be responsible, then the restriction can be self-employed or can be self-directed. Obviously, you know, the knowledge base of a 2-year-old is incredibly limited, but I don't think that 2-year-olds are not amenable to having this basic set of reasoning or this basic model of responsibility posed to them as the mystery which is compelling them to be brought into I'm just trying to think of how I usually refer to this. That the fact is that they don't understand consequences. Therefore, they can't be responsible yet, or at least as responsible that enough required for them to be able to gain the opportunity to understand consequences, to be responsible for themselves. You know, so that's a kind of, it's a slight paradox there. And sort of the solution to that paradox is just general growth and development within the suspension of their own active responsibility. So they know that they're being treated as if their active responsibility is suspended. And that, I think, is a very kind of important category for at least authority to be truthful or transparent about, because otherwise you are literally modeling the kind of confusion which ends up becoming a cult of beautifulness or a cult of beauty within the participatory domain. You have essentially created an untenable rationalization, or, you know, these weirdly associated arguments with dominance and love, and strange kinds of deep confusions, um, because of not making the mystery plain, if I can put it like that. I mean, I guess it depends how much spiritual integrity you feel is necessary to raise your children with. But anyway, I think that this is essentially what destroys IQ points. But anyway, um, the lack of this kind of pedagogy. And responsibility can roughly be defined as uh, the capacity to absorb and burden the consequence, and to continue to make provision, and continue to maintaining a conduit of good hope and good faith, essentially, um, of a good hope and a good faith, a positive teleological outlook, which then itself kind of begs the question slightly of the integrity and the hope of integrity in terms of the perspective being properly edified and formed in a stable sense. Now there are uh, let's say the slightly higher grade problem of the that I've described as sort of being a demigod, because there's a self deception that involves involution into the unconscious or the participatory realm, uh, and there's a kind of sex between the participatory realm and the perspective that needs to be properly digested thoroughly in order to work out the proper differentiation and distinguishing. Anyway, man, I'm flying all over the place. Let me think. Is there anything else that I should say about? So I was mainly wanting to talk about. I mean, yes, you can always be accused of you can always be accused of utilizing heuristics, or having to at some point manifest something that will look like a heuristic, but that doesn't mean that you don't understand and are using consciously something that isn't a heuristic, that just appears to be like one or can be described like one by other people. And and then the fundamental table thumping that everything is fundamentally a kind of participatory heuristic, like, is a nonsense claim. I mean, it is almost like it's a self-refuting kind of thing to bemoan. But assuming that everyone is operating from that kind of mechanism, uh, is already to. I'm doing the opposite of that. I'm assuming everyone is operating from their own understanding, and then I also pay for that assumption. Uh, and that, I think, is basically the technology of the crucifixion that eventually leads to the refinement of the superego. But you have to also have faith in doing that. You can't just kind of do that according to a blind faith because you're following a recipe. So you have to kind of be doing the crucifixion and be doing it like Christ was doing it, as it were. Uh, leaving no stone unturned, having the humility to actually be serious about your intrigue and curiosity as the idea of how your perspective is not properly distinguishing itself or bounding itself in, so you've got your own. Yeah, so I mean, you could call it inferior function management between each side of the mind. But yeah, I mean, I was getting into some mechanics earlier about, how this is, at some point, I think that the unconscious side of the mind loses its teeth when the primary counter offer is finally collapsed, and the thing that is propelling the primary counter offer is the superego providing the answer to the unconscious. You need to stop that from happening. The subconscious needs to provide the answer to the unconscious, and the superego must be still. It must be pristine. It must be cleaned up. The blood of the saints must be recouped from Babylon the Great, so that the New Jerusalem can be structured in its place. And the parent function of the superego can be the tree of life, but also the beast, which represents the death of the superego, can come to life, and the child function can stop being a dragon that sort of is weaving its net around the whole structure of the false. Okay, man, I've jumped around so much in this recording, it's going to be impossible for anyone to follow anything I was saying about the red pulvis solaris thing. Was there another thought that I had about that, which I wanted to talk about in the context of beauty cultism? So I mean, I'm just trying to say that, there are these participatory spheres or layers in the participatory realm, which people roughly compartmentalize, but I'm also trying to generalize them into the same thing. At the end of the day, the only thing you really have is your spiritual compass, and we all essentially are dealing in the same Holy Ghost, which is the same fractal, but we are plotted differently within this holographic matrix, as it were, by our superegos. So we need to fix the superego, as it were, and also, even if we fix the superego, the subconscious will still have us grounded in a particular locale or localization within the fractal scape. But if we can all know that we're dealing with the same fractal, and if we can all, although we will still have our separable, we won't be an interpersonal entity within the unconscious, but we can be in the same category of elect in terms of the excellence of our propositional content, as it were. But that content is I should have said style rather than, because it's not content in terms of the objects to which the propositions are relating to. So it's the same style, but it's also a bespoke substance. And that bespoke substance is something like the white stone, which I think relates to the quality of the inferior function in the ego, is the white stone with the name written on it. Which is, in some sense, I think, the true mark of salvation, essentially. Or the thing that is finally synthesized, and in some sense could also be regarded as the philosopher's stone, or the fully... Because that is really the rudder of the ship, although, or you could, it's both, maybe that's a bad analogy. It's It's kind of at the right. It's the weather vane, but when you look at the weather vane, so you can see which, like how the ship is going to. So it's sort of it's the weather vane that's also the rudder, and it's kind of transcendental dual handle. It is the container of free thought, um, of the the expression of free will, and in some sense it's consonant with the life of what was the sacred contract of the terminal beast, and it is consonant with the lack of control needed to be imposed from the superego child function, and the lack of sort of self-deceiving structure which is inculcated within the superego's dominant function, which is to say that it spells the end of the beast, the dragon, and the false prophet, and then subsequently then the parent function is no longer the tree of the knowledge of good and evil with the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of, but it becomes again the tree of life, because the dominant function, the superego, becomes the New Jerusalem. Okay, yeah, so I think that's a rough roadmap that has everything laid out nicely. Okay, I just want to continue on from my last recording, which was on the subject that it tries to deal with, was a bit maybe ham-fisted or a bit disorganized, but I just want to focus on narcissism for a moment, because I think I've got some new insight into exactly what's going on there, and it was probably slightly confused going through this metaphor of dealing with this other issue. It's probably better to just ground these things directly into psychopathological structures, but I think that, just to reaffirm some other things that I've said, which probably sound a bit strange, saying that, the narcissist, in some broken sense, in some broken way, is doing something roughly correct, but it's doing it in the wrong way, so the whole thing becomes putrid, essentially, or very pathological. But okay, so I think what the narcissist is doing is the narcissist is only interacting with the participatory domain in terms of their subconscious orientation. Their perspectival structure is premised on their false self, and the reason why it's a false self and why they can't even properly inhabit that false self is because all it does is it projects a via positiva interface and connection onto the unconscious participatory domain. So they only have ideal visions of what the participatory domain should contain. They don't have any dread. But because, relative to the subconscious, the way to actually incept yourself, or the way to actually engage or participate from a subconscious perspectival grounding in the unconscious, is through via negativa, is through, let's say, let me just summarize it as saying, a morality of dread. Because their false self has no dread in it, it has to echolocate the contents of the participatory realm by creating a new layer of the unconscious domain, which is something that I've generally regarded, or I've referred to it in my earlier recordings, as an introjective paradigm. So they're introjects. The reason why they're introjects is because they are their subconscious emulation or subconscious modeling of other people's perspectives. So they collect other people's perspectives as introjects, and then from those introjects, so other people have dread. They map other people's belief structures, and then from that, they triangulate the unconscious. But that's also that's very in the ad hoc propositional confabulation ingredient kind of fuel. because they don't have a proper synthesis of these things. Their ego is fragmented because essentially their ego wants to be led by the kite in the high in the sky of their false self, but instead they have a mishmash of all these, a cacophony of differing, let's say, heuristics of dread from modeling other people's perspectives. So they have a disorganized synthesis, which then ends up being curbed or being conflated into just a string of ad hoc rationalization, which is very disjointed even with itself, because essentially, and then it's always grounding that or sourcing that from some inconsistent aggregation of other people's perspectives. So they are piecing together their unconscious domain from a myriad of source material. And then their false self is itself, in some sense, probably triangulated from having a stable source of essentially working out how to have this appear to them in their own unconscious inception. But they can only do that by constantly testing and agitating the ground, so they really need other people to sort of collectively create a collective subconscious in order to manifest a stable unconscious paradigm or something like that. But the mechanics of that is a mechanics of disparate, discordant dissonance, because without that dissonance feedback, they can't keep stable track of other people's belief structure. And so the problem is that they, in some sense, they have found a way to overcome the participatory paradigm through having a system of subconscious and propositional conjunction. But that fundamental model is based on outpacing the participatory domain in terms of promulgating its own solipsistic dominion instead of transcending dominions of the participatory realm itself. So it doesn't generate its own dread. And so because it has to sort of continue to up the ante of the via positiva daisy chain association sort of investment Ponzi scheme, it just keeps on going off further and further and further on a limb in order to save enough face by the conclusion, so it's sort of, the idea is that they're going to enchant people, that at some point they will cotton on to the strategy of the narcissist, and then they will be in awe because the narcissist is juggling more and more, potentially. And essentially, and that they just need to break people into having reverence for this stylistic mastery of being able to juggle everything, which is essentially what the demigod sociological idea, when the demigod is trying to provide to people an ideology that is constructively a narcissist, and then everyone can somewhat be, these little denizens of cerebral histrionics under the umbrella of this narcissistic ideology. Anyway, so I'm just linking that with that parallel with the so-called demigods are sort of constructive narcissists, but they're trying to do it through a collection of cerebral histrionics, which they even count themselves among them, but then they have sympathy with themselves as a cerebral histrionic, but they're trying to create this collective puzzle of piecing together what will be constructively a collective narcissist. And so then they found a way to use all these different developmental failings and to machine them together into a kind of chimera, into a stable chimera. Anyway, what I think a borderline perhaps is a borderline is similar to a narcissist, but it's the other way around. The borderline is like a demigod, in fact, but they are not trying to create a collective narcissist. They want to have a private narcissist, and they don't want to house it themselves. They want to have it operating external to them, separate to them, so that they don't have to deal with the problem of the false self. So they are like, they don't want to have sympathy with the narcissist, or should I say cerebral histrionic. So they know, in some sense, they want to break it. They know that it, or maybe they intuitively know, maybe they don't care either way. So they are just like a floating ego, and they just want to haunt and inhabit some kind of narcissistic ideology or narcissistic collective. But in some sense, they are actually living out the life of the false self, but they realize that they can't do it from their own subconscious. They need it, that like, if you need other people's dread to actually do the work, it's better to sort of, it's like a Ponzi scheme. They are going to be the fruit of the false self, or the thing is that the borderline is very conscious of what they're doing. They are anticipating the narcissistic structure. They are just very carefully, diplomatically, propositionally making sure that other people are doing the legwork so that they can reap the benefit of it and fill in the figure of the false self and take up that space in some sense. But in some sense, they're not exactly the false self of the narcissist, but they are wanting to inhabit that energy, as it were. So they need somebody else to be a kind of codependent narcissist on them being the oh man, I can't think of the word. There's a word that means that sort of when something is outlined by the sun and it looks just like a shadow, like so they yeah. So I mean, anyway, I guess the actual relationship is the narcissist. The borderline relationship is together the narcissist. And in some sense, they're trying to inculcate a very particular kind of cerebral histrionic that is more a narcissist than a cerebral histrionic, because they are addicted to narcissistic supply, and they are and they are actually propositionally, they've got a kind of propositional program and a propositional structure which they keep on trying to get their hooks into other people's subconscious, so that they can kind of, because it's weird, because they do want to have a shared subconscious with somebody else, but they don't actually care about the coherence of the subconscious. It's so that other people can be jettisoned with the cognitive dissonance of their program, so that they can just have the result or the effect of the benefit of essentially being, they want to get away with being what the false self Scott. So if a narcissist were to actually be the false self and to get away with it scot free, that is what the borderline is actually interfacing. That is the mechanism that they are structuring, but they have to structure it within a codependency, within a they really do have to make their nest in somebody else's subconscious, and they have to incept their subconscious and make it pliable. And they do this essentially also by using the confusion of the participatory domain and the paradox and the fundamental sort of spiritual paradox within that to exhaust the other person into some kind of compliance, into some kind of push button manipulative receptivity. And so it's sort of like the other side of the narcissist. It's all coming from the ego. The borderline is all coming from the ego, which is why also that then they can just suddenly become a different identity. They can just push the reset button and then try all over again, because they can just kind of go through a bit of a psychosis, and then they can just kind of have identity dysregulation, and then they can recoalesce a new starting point to start the codependency again, and to start a a decompartmentalization of the other person's subconscious to make a nest there so that they can engage in this kind of collaborative narcissism in which they get to be the false self of the constructive narcissist. So it's kind of like a variant of the demigod, but it's more interpersonal than it is universal egotism. So it's kind of like it's propositional within the ambit of a participatory foil which is trying to inculcate you could call it something like a perverse therapeutic alliance that is there in essentially to provide therapy for the constructive narcissist, which they are trying to codependently um, and so this is someone who, depending on my psychological models, I'm not sure what the sort of if there's a particular ontological development, or if it's different depending on the particular metatype, or it's particular on the subtype of metagram circuit. If this is orientated by guna, that essentially this might be a guna that starts off their false ego complex in their ego, although I've also speculated that everything starts in the ego and then the subconscious, that is the first thing, and that the subconscious might even be prior, or that they're simultaneous. So anyway, it might be that either that the ego always overpowered their own subconscious and they never tried to have an authentic subconscious. And so in some sense, because little girls, perhaps more particularly, can get away with using their nominal identity than having to actually develop a grounded integrity within themselves, that they just kind of continued that motif. They just used that as an operating strategy, and then worked out that you can get other people to sort of give you therapy to your subconscious by being codependent with their subconscious, and then essentially uncovering or discovering or intimating from your environment that narcissism is something that can be harnessed and corralled as a way to constructively, in some sense, overcome the participatory domain, but someone has to actually do the grunt work. And this has just found a way to actually, the borderline has found a way to be sensitive to finding codependent fodder in order to take on that task for them, to outsource that in their codependent subconscious, so that they can inhabit the false self of the narcissist, if I can put it like that. Uh, which means that they themselves can't be responsible for their own unconscious participatory arena, because if they do that, then the false self already can't function in the participatory arena, because you need dread. If I can just use dread as a summary of via negativa understanding, subconscious understanding, that can actually have enough of a perspective and a belief structure. So essentially, if I can just summarize, narcissists are incapable of shame. They confabulate instead. Now, that's because um, any shame that they do experience is going to be based on one of their other perspectives, which are subordinated to their false self anyway. Um, and another manifestation of this incapability of shame is that they don't take responsibility uh, for their participatory role in anything. Now, the borderline is saddled with those same conditions, and when they complain about the shame and things like that, it really is an act. It really is. This is the hook of the subconscious codependent lure into the game of codependency, into the game of a therapeutic alliance and collateral external support for their subconscious perspective. And even if they don't get that collateral support, the idea that they can dramatize about it means that essentially there is a general hope that somebody else will eventually come into the picture and be the white knight and pick up the tab and pay the dividend, as long as the dramatization is still in effect. So as long as they are consistent in their behavior in this act, in this strategy, there is an idea that it will pay full dividend. And that's part of this addiction to them being categorically the false self of the narcissist, in need of a narcissistic subconscious to machine it for them, so that they can actually inhabit the role of the false self, of the idealized self of their subconscious, which, so a narcissist in some sense actually pays for their own psychopathology because they're sort of stuck in it, whereas the borderline is doing it inversely. They're doing it from the ego, and I would argue that they're also doing it very consciously. It's a chess playing demon. I mean, really, it's they really are doing it on purpose, as they complain that they're not doing it on purpose and that they just don't understand. Well, it's because their subconscious is not made to understand anything, and because it just doesn't take responsibility for anything. And so they're always confused and mystified by the unconscious, because they are trying to interface with the unconscious in a way that is fundamentally just via positiva. So then they all are trying to always aggregate sort of, let's say, sympathy for the fact that they just have all these positive wishes for how they wish to be seen in their participatory, objective, third person perspective. So they are really settled on wanting to have dominion over the participatory domain from the strategy of the ego, but they are very cleverly crafting this in such a way so that they can't see that it's an impossible project, because in some sense they know it's an impossible project. That's why they want to get a codependent grunt to do the butler work, and to make it happen for them, and to burden the contradiction and the inconsistency. They need someone. And so this is why the borderline goes through the same phases as the narcissist in terms of idealization and discard and devaluation, or swap those last two around. Idealization, devaluation, and discard. They do the same thing. And although they won't discard unless they have another target, another hope of securing the codependent satisfaction of their false self. Although you can't, I'm using that language because I'm borrowing it from Sam Vaknin's description of narcissism. The borderline is not technically a narcissist. They are much closer to a variant of demigod as I use that jargon for a psychopathology disturbance of development. But essentially, the borderline is speaking to you as the false self, as they are the false, as performing the role of the false self. So this is why I say that they are a chess playing demon, because they are literally talking to you through a lore, through through a baited hook, through a mask of entrapment. Their whole supposed subconscious social mask or whatever is, their whole unconscious participatory realm is a kind of solipsistic desert of imprisonment. It's just like a giant worm with a gaping maw of a mouth, just wanting to consume everything. Sort of. I'm trying to poetically describe something, from like the scene of Dune, or that is just a desolate. They're not interested. It's just there for you to learn their pattern of their codependency so that you can organize the participatory realm relative to your subconscious, and you just have to make their false self that they represent. They just want to be this image that they project into your brain, into your somehow your codependent. They want to be the head of the ego, but you have to do all the grunt work, and you have to toil for them in the desert of their unconscious, while have to relate to the unconscious according to. You have to relate to the participatory realm according to their prescripts and their desires and their notions of what would be right and correct, to make their simplistic false self function, while at the same time you have to burden the contradiction of their impossible anticipations and expectations, because they don't correspond, like, because they don't take responsibility for their unconscious. So this is why everything always devolves into them telling you what their wishes are and what their intentions are. It's all relative to them, and they have no ability to actually take responsibility for what other people perceive and what other people see in their perspective and believe in their perspective. They just instantly discard it. They instantly eradicate it. They instantly delete it, because it's just waiting to be decompartmentalized so that their codependency can be um, uh, facilitated. So they're just, and this is the thing, is that they are so committed to this, and what you are talking to when you're talking to a borderline is so dead set on unilaterally getting you into this, and they never stop. That's the only thing, that's the top and the only thing on their to-do list in terms of their values, of their beliefs, because their values and their beliefs have no actual good hope and faith that respects other people as agents. It's just them and what they want. There's nothing else. And they will even cry about, oh, yeah, well, I'm a prisoner of this, that I can only think of myself, and I feel so sorry that I am doing this to everyone around me, and it's just more and more dramatization. Well, just take responsibility, stop doing it. If you really care, then why don't you stop? They're too busy crying about it to ever stop, because it's just they never actually take the time to stop. You know, and actually care about other people. They just like looking like they do, essentially. And so, they because this is the trick that they use to pull the wool over people's eyes, is they use this paradox around the participatory realm. Okay, well, now I've gone through this whole dramatization, so now you have to see that. Now you have to treat me like I always wanted to be treated, and you have to give me the codependence that I wanted all along, because I went through this journey with you. It really is. I mean, it really is fundamentally parasitic on concocting a kind of desert, a kind of fake journey, a fake quest, so as to form a kind of trauma bond so that they can get their codependency. They don't care about a shared understanding. Uh, they can manufacture one. They can try to mimic one from their egoic chess playing demon, kind of calculation. So I would say that, yeah, they're very good at reading. They have a very integrated ego with their inferior function. Just they're doing it they're doing it for evil. They're doing it for dominion and for solipsism and for subconscious domination. But you see, it's worse in the borderline because the narcissist actually is a solipsist. The narcissist naturally developed the solipsism to protect themselves from the unconscious. The borderline sees into the unconscious very, very clearly. They're choosing to operate the strategy to create codependency just because they want to live out the fruit of narcissism, to be the actual false self, and to feel the position of the idealized subconscious within the participatory domain. They just need somebody else to to square that circle. They need a cerebral histrionic, really. They ideally they need a kind of they really need to condition someone into being a cerebral histrionic. Only a cerebral histrionic would tolerate that kind of treatment. In fact, a cerebral histrionic is probably almost the outcome of exposure to borderline uh, agitation, if I can put it like that. So, if femininity itself, and generally speaking, I mean, it is one of there's a reason why I think that generally this borderline is associated with feminine um, tropes and feminine stereotypes and behavior, is because uh, at least in that form, it could be culturally suppressed because it could be understood, it could be modeled within that idiom. Um, at least it could be suppressed um, in the male quadrant of the population. If I can, okay, look, I don't often like talking about sociological things exactly, but just going to make that parallel. Um, and hmm, Like, I mean, I'm very aware that people say that the numbers are the same in terms of people that have borderline personality disorder, that the numbers are the same for males and females. But I think it's very interesting that all of the male borderlines that I have met have, on average, had a much healthier, or let's just say, a less pathological strategy. That the women have always been um, or not in absolutely every single case, but that's right. I was just interrupted, and I don't know where I was. Saying something about borderlines and narcissists. Anyway, I guess yeah. I think that this. Anyway, it's all becoming clearer to me, I guess. But something that is worth looking at is what? Yeah, I still have clerical work to do. Anyway,